Hello and welcome back to Book Talks hosted by Lou. I'm your host, Lou, and today's episode is going to be so much fun. I'm sure by now you've seen the title. My guest is the one, the only, Lauren Asher. We all met Lauren Asher through her Dirty Air series, and for those who don't know, Dirty Air follows 4 professional Formula One drivers and their love stories. Up until that point, I had never seen Formula One be the sport in a sport romance. I mean, like most of you, I've read football, I've read soccer, I've read basketball, I've read golf, but I'd never read a Formula One romance. And for those who've never watched a Formula One race or haven't watched Drive to Survive on Netflix, Formula One is exciting. It's energetic. There's truly something in the air when you attend a Formula One race. Unlike any other sporting event, the stakes feel higher and it's just so intense that it makes for an excellent setting for a romance to take place. There's so much riding on these athletes and their careers, and adding the element of romance and the challenge of romance is just, it makes sense. The reason that Dirty Air is so special to me was because when I had just started watching Formula One, I noticed that it's very male dominated in terms of the athletes, but the fan base as well was very, very male dominated too. And so upon stumbling on the Dirty Air series, and obviously it was written by a woman, that allowed me to connect to other female Formula One fans, and it felt less isolating. And it was this community. It was this community all because we liked Formula One. And so I just feel like the bond that I have with Dirty Air is very special because I love Formula One, and it was so refreshing to find someone else who also equally loved Formula One as much as I did. The next big project for Lauren Asher after Dirty Air was the Dreamland Billionaire series. Book 1 of the Dreamland Billionaire series follows Rowan and Zara. It is a grumpy sunshine. It's very cute. Zara's character is very positive and very optimistic, and Rowan is very stressed out. He has a lot on his mind. And they have this very sweet, very, very cute relationship. I think it was super refreshing to read. And then for book 2 in the series, which is what we'll be talking about today, a little later on, Terms and Conditions. Terms and Conditions, and I won't get too detailed about it, follows Declan and Iris. And just to give you a fair warning, I fangirl a lot over Iris. I loved her. She is my favorite. And I've read the book at this point several times. And I do this because I want to make sure that I'm not reading under the influence per se, because sometimes when you read a book for the first time and then you reread it again, you start seeing... No, I've read this book several times and I cannot find a single fault with Iris. I loved her character. I loved her progression. I loved her story arc. I loved everything about her. Oh gosh, it was perfect. It was just perfect. I loved Iris's character in many ways. And Lauren and I kind of dive into that a little later on, but just a warning in advance that I gush and squeal over Lauren, of course, but by extension, Iris. But enough about me and my fangirling. Thank you again to Lauren, who we'll hear from in a little bit, for joining me and for taking the time. And thank you guys for listening. Don't forget to like and give a 5-star rating to this episode, and follow, of course, so you don't miss any updates of mine. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, LUU_reads, and at LLUUUU_ on TikTok. Without further ado, here is Lauren Asher. Hey, Lauren. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited you're here too. This has been a long time coming. I feel like we've had something in the works since August almost, but it just never worked out. So I'm glad that I have a podcast now, and it's essentially just an excuse to hang out with people that I like and authors that I love. I'm just gonna take a minute and fangirl. I'm a huge fan of yours, like in a very weird, in a good weird way. I feel like our journey began with the Dirty Air series, obviously.
Yes.
Um, and that's what drew me to you. That's sort of what introduced me to you as an author. I loved reading the Dirty Air series for many reasons. Yeah, Formula
Aw.
One, hot guys, great plot. It was such a fun ride. I love Formula One for many, many reasons, and we'll get to that in a minute. However, the fine print and terms and conditions, so I want to say upgraded my obsession with you in a way that I never thought was possible. Like, I had fun reading Dirty Air, but I genuinely never wanted these books to stop. And
Uh,
so I'm so glad that you're here. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, I'm going to start off by asking you a very sort of general question, just to, if there are any future writers out there curious about your process. What inspired you to start writing? Where did it all start for you?
well, for writing romance, it started really right before I started writing Throttled. So I originally had an idea to write a golf romance. And I started writing that book, and it had another Hispanic heroine. And what really pushed me to want to write a book was, in general, I wanted to write about a Latinx heroine and then maybe a hero, depending on how it worked out. And if I ended up writing more books, which I did. And the reason behind that is I'm Hispanic. I've always identified that way. I was born and raised in Miami, surrounded by a lot of that culture and just all different types of Latin, influences. And I felt like in some of the books I read, I really wanted to relate to a character that way. And I just never had that connection. So that's what pushed me originally to say, I want to write a romance book because I've read at that point, I think like 300. I've been reading them since I was in high school and when I probably shouldn't have, and had very awkward conversations about why I was reading, 50 Shades of Grey. And from there on out, I just became really passionate about the genre and, in particular, like contemporary romance. I love all the other types of romances too that I can get into later because I'm a big sci-fi and paranormal and fantasy romance lover. But that's how it started. Was I wanted to read about Hispanic heroine, and it started with a golf romance, and that did not work out. So
So that's my follow up question. Did you jump into Throttled right away, or did you have rough drafts that exist somewhere on your computer that will never see the light of day? How was that? How was that journey for you to come to a published version of Throttled?
that's a good question. Yes, there are drafts. It all starts with a very, very rough draft. And I actually didn't almost write Throttled because the reason I mentioned that original book was I received some really harsh feedback about it from a potential editor that I was interested in. No one I worked with now, but just someone I had asked, like, is this a book you want to read? And they said, probably not. And I said, okay, well, I guess I'm not cut out for this type of, writing romance. I'll just stick to reading. And I started watching Drive to Survive, and it sparked this idea that became Throttled. So from that original draft, it's stayed pretty consistent. Like the story I had started with Throttled remained that way. Like there was always Maya the vlogger, Noah who was the best racer, and then her brother who happened to become his teammate. So while there are rough drafts that probably will never see the light of day, the final product is one that I feel like is consistent with that original spark of the idea.
I'm super curious about the writing process because I've started writing as well, and my computer is littered with, half of a first chapter, a synopsis. And so I finally finished the first chapter of a really great idea. And so I'm always curious to sort of pick the brain of an author because when you write, do you ever say, "Oh, this is a bad sentence?" Because I only bring this up because several times during terms and condition, I highlight a sentence simply because it's a good sentence. I'm like, "Oh,
Mm.
this is a good sentence." I like how it expressed the emotion and it put that image in my head as a reader. And so how does that come? Is it like natural to you, or did you progress and kind of come to this point in terms of skill and ease of communication?
I wish I could say that it's super easy, like a snap of my fingers, it comes out and I write it. But I think that that's not the case. And exciting news that you're starting writing. I just wanted to touch on that, which is amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, especially in the beginning, it's easy to get caught up in like writing structure, sentence structure, like syntax, but sometimes you just have to write to like get the words out. And that's what I try to do when I find myself getting caught up in, oh, how do I make this sentence perfect or it's not good enough? I will kind of step back and say, I need to get past, I just need to write the story first, the plot, the characters, what they're going through, and then go back and start really looking at the emotions more. I kind of do, I would say I go through about 12 different drafts of my book at the very least. So there's a lot of progress that goes from the first one, which is a really rough, like just the bones, to then the middle product that has emotions, those like more, I guess, the pretty sentences, the teaser sentences. That doesn't come until way later in the process, I would say.
I definitely did notice that, and just sort of like to talk about me for a
Mhm.
second, that sometimes a sentence just falls out and it's wonderful, and then other times it's very, very rough, and it gives me hope because I at one point, I'm just like, "Lou, just write, just get to the end of this chapter, just aim for 3,000 words, just make sure that, at the end of this chapter, this is what the characters need to accomplish. If you were reading your book, would you read the second chapter?" And sort of I was trying to put myself in that space, and I guess my next
Mhm.
question is, what is your process in terms of where do you have to be to write the very best? Like, do you isolate yourself? Some authors get a hotel room and sit down for a couple of days. Some people write, by the beach. Do you have a ritual when you write? And specifically when you're trying to draw inspiration for these, characters and scenarios, is there a ritual that you have?
I would say I work a bit in chaos. I do not have the hotel room. I do live by myself this year. So I've had that opportunity to write alone and see how I like it because I was used to writing more during the hours I could while working, a much busier schedule and trying to fit it in wherever I could. So it would be, in a busier area, kind of hiding my computer, making the brightness way too low. Probably terrible for my eyesight, but great for writing without getting embarrassed. But I prefer definitely writing by myself without much noise. I'll put my noise canceling headphones on, put some music depending on my mood. A lot of my books I actually write to just either like acoustic hits or Taylor Swift albums. I'll just play the whole thing on repeat to get me in a mood to write. But I would say that my process varies as far as where I'm located, and my best writing is done when I'm not as stressed. I will say that this year it took me longer to write a book because I felt like I was under a lot of just other pressures. But now I kind of know, okay, you can clock out a book, but so long as you kind of have your environment stable and you just take a step back and remember why I'm doing it. I think that's what's most important too.
Um, Sort of in terms of your timeline, did you write Redeemed when you were living alone? And or was Terms and Condition the first book that you wrote sort of independently in sort of this quiet environment?
I will say the environment I wrote all